Good evening, and welcome back to another quiet drift through the dusty corridors of forgotten history. Settle in, adjust your pillow, take a deep breath, and let your eyelids grow a little heavier. So let us turn our gaze to a surprisingly overlooked quirk of Roman society: the strange world of public performance. Gladiator fights, chariot races, mock sea battles, and theatrical performances were part of the very fabric of life in Rome. But amidst all this, grandeur was a less glamorous side. Public disorder, mob behavior, and how even enjoying a show too loudly could bring about dire consequences. Tonight, we journey to a time when theater was not simply entertainment. In ancient Rome, it could be a matter of law, order, and punishment. A comedic line poking fun at a powerful political figure could spark anger from loyalists. Or, most curiously, entire groups might show up not to watch the play. Theaters were sometimes shut down entirely. Soldiers were stationed at the entrances. Curfews were enacted on festival days. During a performance at one of Rome's major theaters, a riot broke out, sparked not by the content of the play, but by rival fan groups fighting over which actor was the best. This wasn't a handful of drunken teenagers, it was hundreds of grown men shouting and throwing bricks. Some reports even claimed small fires were set. But to shout for their favorite performance troupe, fight rival fans, and hurl garbage at actors they disliked, theaters were not quiet temples of art like the ones we imagine today. Simply for shouting too loudly during a performance and refusing to calm down. At this point, Rome had three major forms of public entertainment: the ludi circenses, and the ludi gladiatori. It was both adored and feared. The same state that punished riots also poured public funds into new theater. It wanted obedience, but also spectacle. Even clapping too enthusiastically could get you labeled a disturber of the peace. It wasn't unusual for a popular actor called a histro to gain a fan following akin to a modern-day pop star. But the problem wasn't the performances themselves. It was the audience. All of these were held in large venues. Theaters, circuses, or amphitheaters were almost always free to attend, sponsored by wealthy citizens hoping to win public favor. You've waited in line since dawn to get a good spot close enough to the stage to see the actor's expressions, but not so close that you're at risk if a fight breaks out. Always concerned with morality, order, and appearances, Augustus decided that this kind of unruliness needed to be met with strict, visible discipline. It was communal, it was emotional, and sometimes it was dangerous. The crowd roars with laughter, but just a little too loudly. Did these punishments continue into later emperors' reigns, or did the theater grow more tolerant over time? First, actors were banned from forming political alliances. That is, they could not be sponsored by senators or noble families. Another group yells back, defending their own favorite performer. Why is everyone so angry? Insults fly. A rock is thrown. A soldier blows a whistle and pushes his way through the crowd. Second, a rule was enacted that those who started or participated in riots at theaters could face banishment or even corporal punishment. People came from all walks of life: merchants, slaves, freedmen, senators, women, and foreigners. Performances might be comedic farces, bawdy tragedies, or mythological reenactments. But what united these gatherings was the potential for them to spiral into disorder. They were chaotic, sweaty, emotional arenas where citizens shouted, booed, cheered, and sometimes rioted. In Rome, even laughter could be a crime. In this day, it just might be, yes, believe it or not, there was a time when laughter could land you in serious trouble and, not metaphorically, the Roman Empire, by the height of its power, was a city of spectacle. Rome, you see, was noisy, not just in the sensory way, but politically, socially, even emotionally. Let's begin in the 1st century BC. The theaters, especially, were volatile. Actors were controversial figures, often beloved by the people and loathed by the elite. Crowds in Roman theaters could grow unruly very quickly. A cheering section for a popular actor might turn on a head. And this wasn't just an occasional issue. By the time of Emperor Augustus, theater riots had become a consistent public menace to control the chaos. Roman officials began treating these events not just as performances, but as security risks. But none of it worked. In 23 BCE, things reached a boiling point. The emperor had had enough. Enter Augustus, Rome's first emperor and a master of public image. He issued new regulations that might seem absurd today, but were entirely serious in their time. And here's where it gets bizarre. Some rioters were forced into labor. Others had their citizenship revoked. One well-documented case involves a man sentenced to public flogging. The idea was to make an example of those who disrupted public order. But over time, the line between punishment and absurdity began to blur. The real strangeness came not just from the harshness of the punishments, but from the fact that the theater was still encouraged. There are stories recounted by later Roman historians of men being arrested for laughing at the wrong joke, or for making gestures during dramatic scenes that were seen as politically subversive. And yet, the public kept coming back. Why? Because in a city as tightly controlled as Rome, theater was one of the few spaces where people could feel something together: joy, sorrow. So imagine yourself there, dear listener. You're seated in a crowded Roman theater in the blazing afternoon sun. You're watching a performance of Miles Gloriosus, a popular farce by Plautus. A brash soldier is bragging about his romantic conquests. A group in the back begins chanting the actor's name, louder and louder, until it drowns out the next scene. You think to yourself, this is just a play. But by now, you know better. So what became of those fanatical theater? What did Augustus do to permanently curb their behavior? Let's continue, then softly now, as we move from the raucous shouts of Rome-esque crowded theaters into the quieter corners of imperial policy and everyday enforcement. You've already witnessed how laughter, cheers, and boos could ignite full-blown chaos. But in this next phase, we explore how the Roman state, with its love of order and control, responded not just with harsh laws, but with a growing culture of surveillance, classification. Tonight, we walk deeper into the empire's attempt to regulate not only violence, but emotion itself. For example, the Lex Julia Theatralis divided theater seating by social class. Senators sat in the front rows. Knights were given special sections. Ordinary citizens were pushed farther back, and women and slaves even farther still. It was an architectural strategy, literal layering of Roman hierarchy into stone and wood. In the aftermath of the infamous theater riots of the late Republic and early Empire, the Roman leadership under Augustus and his successors sought not only to punish offenders, but also to institutionalize theater itself. If the people would not behave, perhaps the institution could be tamed. They weren't just guiding guests, they were monitoring behavior. Surveillance, though not yet formalized, became cultural. A cheer could be more than a cheer-it, could be a statement of support or dissent. A laugh at a seemingly innocent line might carry layered meaning. A man sitting in the wrong section might be reported. It was a mirror, a battlefield, and a whisper campaign, all in one. In one case, a man who had jeered at a musical performance was forced to listen to it again, alone, repeatedly, as a form of psychological torment. Another was sentenced to a day-long recital of tragic poetry, bound to a chair, unable to leave. It was, as you may know, not a ruler famed for calm temperament, but he had a curious obsession with performers. He declared his favorite mimes and tragedians exempt from arrest, and at one point threatened to banish any senator who booed during a show. No one could leave, not for hunger, not for illness, not even for childbirth, as some writers later exaggerated. At least one man reportedly leapt from a balcony to escape, injuring himself but avoiding political suspicion. A woman shouting too loudly might be removed, not always violently, often just publicly, with embarrassment as the punishment. Plays were censored, and some scripts were banned altogether if they contained veiled criticism of authority figures. Augustus introduced sweeping reforms, not just to calm theater audiences, but to shape them. In Augustus's eyes, chaos in the theater was more than a public nuisance. A cobbler who shouted during a play might be fined a day's wages. A vegetable seller who disrupted a festival show with heckling might have a stall seized. These weren't executions or beatings. They were administrative disruptions, meant to inconvenience. He performed in public, often forcing senators to attend his shows and applaud for hours. Applause was monitored. Lack of enthusiasm could be interpreted as dissent. Standing ovations were expected even real. One clause describes the penalty for inciting unrest during the Ludi Publicia month of forced labor maintaining the theater's latrines, and the next you re-handed a shovel and told to scrub the public toilets for 4 weeks. It was a reflection of moral decay, so if you could segregate the crowd, you could control the mood. A senatorial riot would be unthinkable, but poor, unemployed Romans packed tightly together. A different story. To enforce this stratification, ushers and guards were stationed throughout the venues. There was something primal about the theater in Rome. It was ancient, yes, but not quiet, applauding at a triumphal parade, encouraged, but spontaneous, emotional outbursts in a theater, that was dangerous. It was a place where citizens could test the limits of speech, satire, sarcasm, and support. It spreads, and it can be turned into mockery in a heartbeat. Did the punishments succeedor? Did they simply become part of the performance? Wooden seats were broken apart and used as clubs. The show was canceled. The emperor responded by closing the theater for a full year-end, executing 2 audience members as instigators. Still, this wasn't enough. Just the phrase, disturbers of the peace. Some emperors doubled down. Under Tiberius, Augustus's successor, actors themselves began to be punished more frequently for inciting the crowd, and yet audiences adapted. The Roman people were clever. They learned how to speak in code. Theater became both dangerous and sacred. It was the one place where ordinary Romans could even briefly participate in something powerful. One of the strangest examples of this era comes from a series of edicts issued during the reign of Caligula. Unlike Tiberius or Augustus, Caligula loved actors, not just tolerated them, but befriended and even mimicked them. He performed on stage himself. This led to bizarre outcomes. When riots did occur, Caligula sometimes punished audiences rather than performers. These were not standard punishments, but they reveal something fascinating. Rome had begun experimenting with emotional discipline as a tool of governance. By the time of Nero, perhaps the most infamous of all Rome's stage-obsessed emperors, the boundary between state and theater had nearly dissolved. Nero was not merely a lover of the arts, he considered himself an artist. There's one well-documented case from 65 CE during a festival performance in the Greek style. Nero sang and played the lyre for hours. The doors were locked. While Nero saw himself as a divine performer, his rule tightened the noose around what had once been a form of free, messy, emotional catharsis. And yet, the Roman people kept going to the theater. Why? Because the alternative was silence. And Rome, if nothing else, was a city that craved noise. But what about the everyday punishments? Outside the imperial elite, common punishments continued in the streets. But some cases were darker. A marble tablet discovered near the ancient theater of Pompey contains a series of laws about audience conduct. Imagine that. One moment you're booing an actor for a poor joke. Other punishments included public humiliation, being forced to wear placards declaring your offense, or to sweep the stage in front of the actors you had insulted. Yet even these measures failed to fully tame the Roman audience. Sometimes, of course, this veered into chaos. One riot, during the reign of Domitian, began over a comedic impersonation of a famous general. His supporters erupted in anger. Fistfights turned into a full-out brawl. Their names were never recorded. And this brings us to a broader question. If the Roman state tried so hard to control public joy and grief, what does that say about how power functioned in the empire? Rome could tolerate noise, but only the right kind. Cheering for an emperor? Fine, because laughter is hard to predict. Rome feared that, so it built laws around it. Punishments, restrictions, and still, the people laughed. So what happened in the end? Did Rome ever truly manage to silence the theaters? Let us continue. As the candle burns lower, and the Roman streets grow quieter in your mind's eye, We've seen how the ancient theater spaces meant for storytelling, and song became battlegrounds of social tension, power, and punishment. And now, in this final stretch of the story, we'll watch how this curious war between joy and control played out over centuries, and how, like all things Roman, it eventually transformed, because the empire never really silenced the laughterette, merely redirected it. As Rome entered the 2nd century CE, many of the overtly bizarre punishments for theatrical unruliness began to soften. The era of emperors like Nero and Domitian, where theater politics could cost you your life, gave way to a more bureaucratic, regulated calm. That didn't mean audiences became tame. Far from it. The Roman populace, especially in large cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and, of course, Rome itself, had come to see the theater not just as amusement, but as a rare stage for public voice. Even under emperors less obsessed with performance, like Trajan or Hadrian, the government had to manage crowd behavior very carefully, was to let the people pretend they were already rebelling. During a time of great plague and anxiety, he funded open-air comedic performances in public squares. He knew that a restless crowd was a dangerous one, and that laughter, regulated carefully, could serve as a pressure release valve. To do this, the empire refined its systems. Seating laws were better enforced. Crowd control became an engineering problem. It was understood. Let them joke. Let the actor wear a mask resembling a corrupt tax collector. Theaters remained open in many cities, but performances changed tone. Farce gave way to spectacle. Laughter was replaced with violence. Let him be mocked. Let the people feel, just for a moment, that the system saw their frustration, and magistrates were posted to major events not as spectators, but as censors of emotion. But it wasn't all suppression. In fact, what followed was something perhaps more intriguing: co-opting emotion into the imperial machine. The empire learned to let the people vent, but in controlled ways. Mimes and satirists were allowed to poke fun at fictional officials or abstract ideas of government corruption. They were theatrical punishments, a blending of performance, power, and pain. And perhaps that was the point. Entire genres were born out of the need to entertain without actually criticizing the emperor directly. A man might dress as Orpheus and be torn apart by actors dressed as wild animals, or church leaders saw theaters as dens of sin. Performers were condemned as morally corrupt. In some regions, clergy banned believers from attending entirely. These plays were ridiculous, crude, and loud-filled with flatulence, disguises, and slapstick. But they worked. Crowds laughed. And then they went home. Rome had learned that sometimes the best way to avoid a riot. One fascinating example of this appears during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, known more for his Stoic philosophy than his love of theater. But he understood people, and the laws that once sentenced men to latrine duty for shouting during a performance were left to rot on forgotten stone tablets. In medieval Europe, the plays of Rome were copied, recopied, and performed again. The spirit of Roman humor, loud, risky, deeply human, never truly vanished. But in a city where public punishment was normal and where law was theatized, such spectacles became an accepted, chilling part of urban life. The records show that during these events, even when jokes turned critical, the magistrates rarely intervened. One scribe recorded a man shouting, "He dies better than he dances," as a condemned prisoner collapsed in dramatic flair, because if they laughed, they weren't rebelling. Still, even this delicate balance could collapse. By the 3rd century, during the crisis of the empire, at time marked by rapid emperor invasions, inflation, and near-collapse, discontent became harder to mask. This is when we see the rise of mock-ex. Condemned criminals were sometimes costumed as mythological figures and brought into theaters or amphitheaters to perform roles, which ended in their real deaths. These were no longer plays. You might ask, what did the audience think of this? Strangely, they cheered. At least some did. Others wept. Yet even amid this brutality, echoes of the old riotous laughter still remained. Writers like Suetonius and the anonymous authors of the Historia Augusta note that, even during executions, some audiences joked about poor acting. The line between laughter and cruelty had fully blurred. But this story must end, as all Roman things do. By the 4th century CE, with the rise of Christianity, the Roman relationship to theater and, by extension, to public laughter underwent a slow but steady transformation. Punishments for disorder in theaters remained on the books, but became less relevant. Why? Because theater itself was dying. Rome no longer feared. Laughterette ignored it. The great marble venues crumbled. The actors faded into obscurity. And yet, even as the empire fragmented, the memory of Rome's theatrical passions lingered. In Byzantine Constantinople, people still shouted at charioteers and applauded comic might. And here we are, 2,000 years later, talking about how cheering too loudly for a bad actor could cost you your home, your rights, or even your life. It feels absurd. It is absurd. But it's also instructive, because Rome, in its infinite seriousness, taught us something unintentional. Laughter is dangerous, not because it mocks, but because it connects. It spreads. It bonds. It refuses to be tamed. And so, even in a world of emperors, soldiers, and laws carved in stone, a good joke could still start a riot. Now tell me, if joy was once a crime, how many other emotions have we forgotten were once policed? And what does that say about the histories we call boring? Good evening again, traveler of strange histories. Tonight, we drift toward the darkly ritualistic, toward a punishment so peculiar, so symbolic, and so deeply Roman that it defies modern imagination. You've likely heard of crucifixion, of the arena, of exiles and executions. But have you heard of the punishment of the sack? A man sewn inside a leather sack with animals, often a monkey, a rooster, a dog, and most famously, a snake, then tossed into a river to drown. It sounds like something from myth or theater, but it wasn't. It was real. Not just the rituals, but the meaning behind them. The Roman obsession with order, family, and the boundaries between human and beast. For a Roman citizen, particularly a man, the family was not simply a group of relatives. It was a legal entity, ruled by the paterfamilias, the father, whose word was law within the household. And it was reserved for what Rome considered one of the most sacred and most terrifying crimes of all: parricide, the murder of one's father, or more broadly, one's closest family. Tonight, we'll trace the roots of this strange form of punishment. To begin, we must understand how the Romans viewed pietasta, deeply embedded virtue of duty to one's family, the gods, and the state. To kill that figure, to murder your own father, was not merely homicide. There, it was cast into the water, where the man and the animals drowned together. No grave, no ashes, no name carved on stone. It was a rupture in the cosmic order, a violation of sacred duty, a threat to the fabric of society. Then he was dressed in wooden clogs and a wolfskin hood, disguising him, making him less than human. He was sewn into a leather saculius alongside for animals: a dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a snake. It was a taboo, so strong, so culturally condemned, that most Romans couldn't fathom it happening. Can you imagine being sewn into a sack with a dog clawing at your face, a rooster flapping in panic, and a snake coiled near your legs? Let alone as the water rises around you. The monkey was thought to parody human behavior, a grotesque mockery of reason. A young man, possibly mentally ill, was convicted of killing his father. The Senate debated whether the ponacule was too ancient, too cruel. In the end, they chose a modified version, dressing him in animal skins, then executing him by throwing him to wild beasts in the arena. The ponacule was seen as barbaric, theatrical, and pagan. It lingered in memory but not in practice. The rooster, a bringer of dawn, stood in for the lost passage of time, and the snake-well serpents always meant danger or eternal punishment. It had to symbolize the total destruction of humanity and the offender. That's why the punishment had to be more than just execution. Just a man, a dog, and a snake. still sewn in a sack, still drowned. And that's where the Ponakule came in. Only a handful of recorded instances exist across the Republican Empire. He wrote that those who killed their fathers tear apart the very roots of human society. But many scholars believe the practice was older, perhaps a holdover from archaic Roman or even Etruscan rituals. Not to the criminal, but to the city. The earliest mention of this punishment appears in the Lex Pompei, a law from the late Republic, possibly formalized under Pompey the Great in its most complete form. The ritual went like this: of fatherhood, of tradition. A man convicted of parricide was first beaten with rods not enough to kill, but enough to humiliate. Once bound, the sack was hauled to the usually the Tiber. It was a punishment meant to erase identity. Why the animals? That has puzzled historians for centuries. Some suggest it was symbolic. The dog may have represented betrayal, turned against its master. Others suggest practical origins. These animals were common, easy to trap, and scary in close quarters. It was not just death, it was theatrical death, one designed to haunt the onlookers and remind every Roman citizen what it meant to betray the bloodline. And yet, curiously, the Ponakule was rarely used, not because Romans were merciful, but because parricide itself was so unthinkable. It was believed that only a person already monstrous would commit it, and so they were to be punished as if they weren't human. Even Cicero, who loved law and rhetoric, described parricide not as a crime against a person, but against nature itself. But the ritual still existed in law, just in case. One famous case comes from the reign of hate in the 2nd century CE. The symbolism remained. Man becomes beast devoured by the wild. In time, the punishment faded. As Christianity spread through the empire, Roman criminal law began to shift. Mercy, at least theoretically, became a virtue. By the late 4th century, the punishment was largely defunct. Or was it under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century? In the Eastern Roman Empire, the Ponakule was briefly revived, modified, simplified. No monkey, no rooster. Even as the empire Christianized, the ritual clung to life like the animals thrashing in that leather prison. It would appear one last time in legal codes of the early Middle Ages. Then, finally, it vanished. But why was it ever revived at all? What was it about this strange sack, this watery tomb, that Rome could not quite let go? Maybe it was this. The Ponakule wasn't just a punishment. It was a message. It said, "This will not be tolerated." Not just murder, but betrayal of family. It said, "You can kill a man, but you cannot kill your blood without becoming something less than human." And that idea, that fear of becoming a beast, Rome believed that it was worse than death. But still, was it the punishment that was inhumane, or the culture that required such a spectacle just to make a point? What does it mean that Rome had to perform just to remind people that family mattered? And what, perhaps, does that say about us? Let's continue gently now, drifting deeper into the strange current of Roman justice. You already know the eerie details of the Ponaculia leather sack for panicked animals, and a quiet river swallowing the screams, because Rome, with its deep reverence for structure and tradition, didn't stop with the sack. In fact, the empire developed an entire catalog of bizarre, symbolic punishments designed not just to penalize, but to instruct. But tonight, in this next passage, we widen the lens. Each one, like the Ponakule, reveals how the Romans saw law not just as force, but as performance. In this section, we'll walk slowly through some of Rome's strangest judicial rituals, and you may find yourself wondering. And so, in early Roman Republic law codes, those who lied under oath might be sentenced to a punishment called tongue cutting. Was it justice or theater? Let's begin with a punishment for false testimony. Perjury was no minor offense in Roman law. It was seen as a betrayal of civic trust, almost as bad as treason. This wasn't just symbolic. The costume marked them as no longer human. The audience was disappointed, so the officials beat the man, covered him in goat's blood, and tried again. The crowd was being told, "This person is already a beast." Now, this wasn't always judicial. Sometimes it was a family decision. Instead, they were left to fate to animals, to starvation, or to be rescued by chance. But for certain crimes, especially incest or child murder, expositio was used as a state punishment. What you're seeing is not an execution, it's pest control. Some were strange for their emotional or philosophical weight. Instead, they left the gods to decide whether the person would survive or suffer. Now, this wasn't always literal. Densely packed wooden buildings, open flame for cooking, poor drainage Rome burned easily, and often an arson was seen as both dangerous and sacrilegious, since the hearth fire was sacred to Vesta. Sometimes it meant a symbolic gagging being marched through the forum with a heavy wooden bit between the teeth, or wearing a placard announcing your dishonesty. You were labeled a perjurous and could be permanently banned from giving testimony again. Tombs lined the roads outside the city, marked by inscriptions and carved busts. Disturbing a grave whether by vandalism or inappropriate burial was considered an offense not only to the family, but also to the gods of the underworld. But in rare, extreme cases, especially during political purges, were executed by having hot metal clamps placed on their tongues before death, supposedly burning the lie from the mouth. It wasn't about cruelty alone. The idea was to erase the false word from history, to restore the balance of spoken truth in the public sphere. Then there was Damatio ad Bestia's condemnation to the beasts. No stone, no name. They became anonymous markers of what not to do, though usually associated with gladiators and arena executions. It had variations far stranger than simple spectacle. Consider the punishment for debt. Certain criminals, especially runaway, slaves, or traitors, would be dressed in animal skins before being thrown to wild animals. The creditor was allowed to physically grab the debtor in public and declare him seized. If the debt wasn't settled within 30 days, the debtor could be chained and enslaved, not metaphorically, but literally by the creditor. Roman historian Cassius Dio recounts one such case during the reign of Claudius, where a man was tied to a wooden post in a lion's den. But instead of being eaten, the lion merely sniffed him and walked away. It was ritual contamination. The courtroom was the opening act. The sentence was the script. The death, the finale. They had disturbed the domestic gods. Now, they would be marked as Sutborn. The crowd applauded when the lion returned and finished the job. In the context of these other rituals, it becomes clearer. It wasn't just grotesque. It was Rome's way of speaking through symbolism. Crime disrupted the balance between citizen and city, gods and mortals, and family and fate. Punishment had to restore that order, not just by killing the body, but by sending a message through the form of the death itself. Another eerie punishment, often forgotten today, was called the criminal would be left outside the city walls, sometimes on a trash heap or a mountainside, bound but alive. They would not be formally executed because the Romans believed some acts were so vile that no clean execution would suffice. Death was too orderly. Of course, not all punishments were bloody. Take the punishment for arson. Fire was one of the great fears of Roman urban life. So arsonists, when caught, were sometimes bound to the remains of the building they destroyed. Their ashes mixed with the ashes of the ruins. One law even specified that a convicted arsonist must wear the soot of his crime, which meant being covered in charcoal, dressed in black rags, and paraded through the streets before being exiled. This wasn't just public shame. Still stranger were the legal fates of Romans took the resting places of the dead very seriously. In some regions, particularly during the early empire, grave robbers were punished with a symbolic inversion. They were buried alive, but not in a tomb. Instead, they were placed in shallow pits, near crossroads, sometimes standing upright, sealed with wooden stakes. And yet, through all of these strange penalties, Rome didn't punish in random ways. Every sentence, every act of violence had a message behind it. They weren't simply killing criminals, they were staging a lesson. Even the more mundane punishments had symbolic flair. Before later reforms, a man who failed to repay a loan could be sentenced to manus, injectio literally seizure by hand. In some early Roman laws, the creditor was even allowed to cut the debtor's body into pieces, dividing it among scholars debate whether this ever actually happened, but the fact that it was written into law shows how deeply Rome believed in visible, theatrical retribution. So we return now to the Sanctu, to the Roman mind. Law wasn't just about outcome, it was about order, harmony, restoration. It's why so many Roman punishments feel like small plays complete, with costumes, props, and audiences. But does this make it more just or more terrifying? Is justice still justice if it's meant to be watched? And what does it say about a society that could turn punishment into ritual, and ritual into spectacle? Let's settle in now for the quiet conclusion of this particularly strange tale. We've wandered through the symbolic world of Roman punishments, from the eerie leather sack of the Ponacu to ash-covered arsonists, to grave robbers, buried alive. We'll explore how these laws weren't merely deterrents, but reminders anchoring every citizen in a world where justice was performance and morality was spectacle. But in this final section, we'll reflect on the deeper meaning beneath it all. Not just why Rome invented such theatrical punishments, but how these bizarre rituals shaped the lives and fears of ordinary Romans. You've heard whispers of the man sewn in the sack. You've watched mock executions in the forum, or passed by a man wearing a sign announcing his shame. Picture yourself as an average Roman citizen. You're not a senator or a slave, just a small trader, perhaps a baker or a street vendor. Not through personal experience, but through a story. Your life revolves around grain prices, water supply, family, and the rhythms of the public calendar. You likely never commit a major crime, but still, you know all about these punishments. It was about reinforcing order through memorable fear. These events shape your view of the world. You grow up knowing what happens to those who steal from a temple, or harm their father, or lie before a magistrate. The stories are told, like myths, but with real names, real streets, real faces. In a city where most people were illiterate, the law lived in the body, in public space, in rumor and memory. And this is where Roman justice reveals its genius and its cruelty. For Rome, justice was not only about fairness. The Ponacule stands out because it combined everything Roman punishment valued. Cynic, for example, criticized public executions as cruel distractions, yet even he admitted their effectiveness in preserving order. Ritual. The preparation was meticulous: costumes, procession, sacred animals. Others, like exile or humiliation, were accepted as part of civic life. Symbolism. Every creature represented an inversion of society. The family killer was to die as a beast, not summarized in documents. Christian doctrine emphasized repentance, the soul, and divine judgment. Public torture and theatrical executions became controversial, then discouraged, seen, remembered, and felt. Publicity. Though the final moment happened in water, the buildup was very public. Erasure. The body lost, the name cursed. No burial removal, not just from life, but from memory. And most importantly, it was rare. Rome understood that not every law must be used. Sometimes, it was enough that it could be used. Judges wear robes. Sentences are read aloud. There are witnesses, testimonies, openings, closings, and ceremonies. You might wonder, how did Romans themselves feel about these rituals? Were they horrified, fascinated, desensitized? When you steal from the dead, the answer is complicated. Canon law and feudal codes still used shame, symbols, and processions. Trial by ordeal, public penance, stocks in the town square. These were descendants of Rome's performance-based justice. Elite authors like Seneca, Cicero, and Livy often described these punishments with moral weight. Some admired them as instruments of discipline. Others feared them as signs of tyranny. Ordinary Romans likely had mixed feelings. Some punishments, like crucifixion, were viewed as too harsh for citizens, but there was always one shared belief: Roman justice was meant to be seen. And the strange dance of snake, rooster, dog, and monkey no longer repeated, not hidden behind courtroom doors. Over time, however, these punishments faded not because Rome grew more merciful, but because the empire itself changed. As Christianity spread and became the state religion by the 4th century CE, many traditional Roman practices were The ponacule, with its pagan animal symbolism and ritual cruelty, slowly disappeared from use for rare revivals in the Byzantine East. As we mentioned earlier, instead, punishments became quieter, more bureaucratic: exile, imprisonment, fines, or execution without spectacle. But something was lost in that transformation. Because when Rome abandoned theatrical punishment, it also abandoned its most Roman quality: the belief that law must be lived out loud. Even long after the Western Empire fell in the 5th century, echoes of these punishments survived in medieval Europe. And in some ways, even modern justice carries traces of this ancient world. Courtrooms have stages. The law, in any age, speaks not just through logic, but through drama. So what, then, can we learn from the sack? Not just that the Romans were brutal, though they certainly could be, but rather that they believed punishment was a kind of moral theater, that society needed stories terrible, vivid stories too, keep itself together, stories about what happens when you betray your father, when you light a sacred fire, and perhaps in the telling, those stories kept others from repeating them. But still, if justice becomes too much about performance, does it lose its humanity? If the punishment becomes the play, who's the real audience? As we close this tale, the leather sack now long rotted away, the river quiet again, we're left with one final question. Was the ponacule a punishment, or was it Rome's last, desperate prayer for order in a world always on the edge of chaos? Welcome back, dear listener. Let your shoulders settle, your eyes grow heavier, and your thoughts wander once more into the ancient alleyways of Rome, not into the colonnaded forums or great marble baths. This time, but into quieter, humbler corners. Because tonight, we turn our gaze from emperors and executions to something far more ordinary and perhaps more revealing: the small punishments handed down to the average Roman. Not the sack and the snake, not lions and bloodied arenas, but shards of pottery, public scoldings, fines for gossip, and legal consequences for a spilled bucket of waste. This is the dull, dusty world of everyday Roman justice, where punishment didn't roar, it whispered. Let's begin. First, let's step into a Roman vicus, or neighborhood. Who owes whom a loaf of barley bread or a borrowed oil lamp? Imagine it. Tightly packed apartment blocks, cordons, narrow streets bustling with vendors, children, stray dogs, and the occasional litter-strewn gutter. And the consequences, often clever, petty, symbolic, and intensely public. These neighborhoods had their own social structure, resident associations, and even local street judges who handled disputes to minor for city courts. And disputes were constant. Who gets to use the communal oven first? Whose goat keeps wandering into whose laundry? Who dumped kitchen slop out of the 3rd floor again? Roman law, known as jus civile, addressed much of this in astonishing detail. Blocking the flow, stealing water, or letting livestock dirty the basin was seen as serious offenses. If someone accused you falsely of adultery, cowardice in battle, or low birth, especially in public, you could take them to court. That would be too costly. A group of elderly women might arrive at your door, clanging cooking pans, shouting shit, and pelting your windows with broken pottery shards. Instead, they were smashed and often used for symbolic punishment. A dishonest wait seller might have his scales smashed publicly. These weren't violent acts. They were performances designed to expose and correct. This informal ritual, sometimes called a straculum, was a form of neighborhood justice meant to embarrass rather than injure. Instead, Roman law favored something more poetic: symbolic humiliation. Let's talk about defamation, or inuria, one of the most common civil complaints In a world without texting, podcasts, or Twitter, gossip was still a potent weapon. A man didn't need to be rich to have dignity. Even a freedman baker or butcher could be respected if he paid debts, spoke honestly, and didn't dump slop into the street. The punishment wasn't jail. Her name might be written on a wax tablet and posted by the grain vendor's door. Not an arrest, but a social freezing out. Or sit by the stall they robbed, handing out fruit under supervision for an afternoon. It didn't cost him money. It cost him face. In one recorded case, a man who called another a thief and a fool in front of neighbors was sentenced to stand in a forum with a broken pot on his head, marked with a painted insult. Another was made to recite a confession aloud in the same place where he had shouted the slander word for word 3 times. Under watch, Rome had complex regulations, including limits on how high one could stack grain sacks, or how far your stall could extend into the street. A lazy student might be made to wear donkey ears crafted from papyrus. You walk him around the forum at noon, wearing a tunic that says, "Acida stultus, foolish donkey." Another might have to sweep the classroom steps with a broom too tall for him to hold. You now sweep it clean every morning for a week. And sometimes, especially in tight-knit neighborhoods, punishment didn't come from the state but from the community. Sometimes it was embarrassing, tedious, symbolic, and public in the quietest possible way. Consider the pilot for communal water system. Every vicus had a few, and fights often broke out over access, especially during dry months. So did pots, and paint and poetry. If caught, the offender might be sentenced by the local magistrate to clean the entire fountain system, or to stand beside it barefoot for a day, holding a sign that read, "I muddied what is shared by all." In some cases, the punishment wasn't assigned by law at all but by custom. He had to stay there for hours, soaked and embarrassed, learning the value of caution and warning. The tablet read, "Why pottery? Because in Rome, broken pots were everywhere. Terracotta vessels used for oil, wine, grain were the disposable plastic of their time. Once cracked, they couldn't be repaired. A cheating baker might be forced to wear a necklace of baked clay tokens. It wasn't just about pain. It was about displaying guilt. Even children were subject to public correction, though not always through violence. Roman schools were strict. Discipline, often meted out by a pedagogus, included beatings but also symbolic shaming. And if a child was caught misbehaving in the street, let's say stealing fruit from a market stall or mocking a funeral procession, they might be ordered to perform an apology in verse. In short, punishment didn't always wound. Sometimes it merely. The Roman approach to petty crime leaned heavily on reputation. One's dignitas. So when the law intervened, it often targeted that reputation, not the body. For example, a woman who repeatedly failed to return borrowed items might be barred from local market stalls. A man who failed to pay his street taxes might have a red line painted across the front of his home, signaling default. And then there were the punishments tied to urban maintenance laws, perhaps the most boring category of all. These included laws about noise, smell, water runoff, nighttime fires, and animal waste. Violators were often fined, yes, but fines weren't always monetary. Instead, a common penalty was labor-based restitution. You let your laundry water flood the footpath. Your donkey blocked traffic during the morning rush. One of the more curious punishments came from sanitation offenses. Human waste disposal was a serious issue. Most apartment buildings had no plumbing, so tenants often dumped chamber pots from upper window side, usually shouting "K." But when someone failed to warn passers, especially if a magistrate was struck, a punishment could be creative. In one case, preserved in an old legal fragment, the offender was made to stand beneath a slanted roof while buckets of clean water were dumped on him at random intervals. So what do all these small, strange punishments tell us? That in Rome, justice was not always grand or brutal, because Roman society depended on community participation in morality. The courts existed, but so did shame. So did street songs. The message was simple. You live among os decency. And when you broke that rule, you were corrected not with violence, but with ritual. But still, did these punishments truly reform behavior or just drive it underground? Were they reminders of shared values or weapons of social control? And if your dignity could be taken with a bucket of water and a painted sign, how strong was it to begin with? Let's continue. Now, drifting quietly deeper into the daily rhythms of Roman punishment. Not the harsh roar of empire, but the quiet nudge of civic discipline. You've already seen the neighborhood squabbles, the pots on heads, and the painted signs of shame. What happens when public nuisance becomes public threat? When the line between petty and serious becomes thin, slippery, and subjective? But what happens when these small punishments go beyond simple correction? Tonight, we step into the strange middle ground of Roman justice. That gray zone between gossip and crime, between a fine and a flogging. Let's begin with noise, a surprisingly common offense in ancient Rome. Singing drunkards, clanging shop shutters, or over-enthusiastic party guests could be fined or punished under the charge of tabbatio nocturna, disturbance of the night. Rome was loud, streets filled with carts rattling over stone, vendors shouting. The local magistrate ordered him to spend 3 mornings hawking in silence, holding a wooden placard reading, "This fish is quiet, so must I be." Fountains gurgling, construction hammering. The city's famed sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, handled some waste, but not nearly enough for 1 million residents. But there were limits. City ordinances prohibited excessive noise after dark. Strong odors, especially from tanners, dyers, or food stalls, could result in citizen petitions. If found guilty of creating a corruption of the air, a stall owner could be ordered to. But in 18 BCE, Augustus passed the Lex Julia, making adultery a public crime, punishable by exile, property seizure, or worse. In one preserved complaint from Ostia, a fish seller was accused of shouting prices before dawn, waking nearby households. In another case, a tavern that played music too loudly during festivals had its wine jugs publicly smashed and was forced to provide free watered wine to passersby. As penance, she might be forced to sit in a public space, like the steps of a bathhouse, bearing a sign declaring her shame. Sometimes, her family would disown her legally, cutting off inheritance rights. Then there were the odors. Rome had no garbage trucks, no city plumbing, and few public latrines. But simple, everyday stealing. A loaf of bread, a pair of sandals, a cup. The mark would fade. But for days the thief's bandaged hand would speak louder than any court decree. So when smells became unbearable, neighbors complained. Relocate. Pay a fine in oil, or firewood, or even spend a day wearing a wreath of garlic while scrubbing the stone beneath his stall. Many minor civil cases were resolved through arbiters, local elders, or appointed judges who met in open forums. It was less about health and more about shame and about reminding people to live respectfully among others. Instead, they were ordered to sit for one full market day on a raised bench placed in a public square, under full sun. But not all disputes involved foul smells and clanking pans. Some were legal gray areas, moments when personal honor, civic order, and private revenge began to blur. It wasn't torture, it was something far older. Exposure, being seen, being known. Let's look at adultery. For example, before the reign of Augustus, adultery was mostly a private affair settled by families, not courts. But even after this law, punishment for adultery often stayed symbolic, especially for women. A woman caught cheating might be paraded before her neighbors with her hair cut short, wearing a plain tunic instead of her usual finery. A man, on the other hand, was rarely punished unless he had slept with a married woman of equal or higher status. Once labeled infamous, a person might, even then, the most common penalty was a forced apology and a payment of dowry to the offended husband. Hypocrisy, certainly, but also a window into how Romans saw morality as something deeply tied to status, property, and public display. Another fascinating category is theft, but petty, not the grand looting of temples or shipwrecks. Still lived in Rome. Their punishment was subtle, lasting. and largely social. These were usually handled with summary punishment, often in the marketplace itself, a city where you performed your decency every day. A common response, branding the hand not permanently, but with a hot iron pressed long enough to cause blistering. In other cases, thieves were ordered to stand in the stall they robbed, offering apologies and wares to customers under the supervision of the vendor they wronged. And still others were forced to pay restitution not in coin, but in labor delivering water, sweeping steps, and carrying heavy baskets through the forum. Theft, in a Roman view, was a breach not just of law, but of trust, and trust had to be rebuilt in front of others. Now, let's explore one of the more curious punishments of all. The public bench. Roman courts, especially in large cities, were overcrowded and slow. When someone was found guilty of fraud, deception, or repeated offenses, they might not be jailed or fined. There, they sat watched, whispered about, and occasionally mocked. Some brought umbrellas or wore veils. Others wept openly. A few pretended to nap. It wasn't prison. For some Romans, it was the worst fate of all. Perhaps most revealing are the records of repeat offenders, people fined or shamed multiple times, who eventually lost their standing in the neighborhood. These people were called infames, not criminals, but the label could come from repeated small violations. Lying, cheating, disturbing the peace, or even being overly litigious. Be barred from speaking in court. Be excluded from guilds or markets. Be avoided in contracts or marriages, and yet they still walked the streets. They were not imprisoned. They were erased in plain sight. And so we begin to see a pattern. Rome, in its daily rhythms, wasn't a city of constant violence. It was a city of constant watching, where shame did more work than chains, where gossip could ruin you faster than a judge, where pots and placards kept the peace more effectively than soldiers. This wasn't justice by punishment. It was justice by presence, by eyes, by neighbors, by whispers in the bathhouse, and by glances in the market. But even here, in these petty punishments, a question lingers. If your dignity can be torn down by clay pots, bad poetry, or a day in the sun, did you ever really own it? And when a society turns every neighbor into a judge, who dares to make a mistake? Let's return one final time to the back streets and bathhouses of ancient Rome, not for grand tales of conquest or assassination, but to witness the slow, soft hum of daily order being maintained. We've seen the broken pots, the garlic garlands, and the red lines painted across shop doors. In fact, for many small infractions, the people themselves acted as the courtroom, the jury. Most homes opened directly onto the street. Laundry was dried above walkways. Meals were eaten by open windows. Baths were shared. Water was fetched from communal fountains. He bows wine and returns vinegar. And with this constant exposure came constant scrutiny. And even the executioner, though execution in this case might mean exclusion, ridicule, or a smear of mud on a doorframe. And now, in this final section, we'll look at how these small, symbolic punishments helped shape Roman identity. How they built a culture where law wasn't only enforced by judges, but by reputation, ritual, and reminder. And when someone broke a religious promise, they might be cursed by name with a defixio, a small lead curse tablet. Tonight, we close this story not with a punishment, but with a reflection. By the late Roman Republic and into the Empire, community regulation had become so embedded into daily life that many punishments no longer required state enforcement at all. In Rome, your life was lived in public. Some were political, others are romantic, but many were, in effect, written judgments of behavior. If you lied, it was remembered. If you broke a promise, it echoed. And if you cheated well, the punishment might not arrive as a soldier's boot, but as a cold shoulder or 1,000 small, whispered wounds. No official record, just public shame etched in stone for everyone to see. If a vendor cheated a customer and was caught, he might offer free bread or a symbolic item, a carved wooden dove, a sprig of olive, or a wax figurine. representing goodwill. One of the most enduring tools of everyday punishment was the graffiti. Romans loved graffiti. They scratched poems, jokes, complaints, and boasts onto the walls of homes, temples, and even public toilets. One scrawl from Pompeii reads, "Marcus the Fooler steals soap from corpses." But so was redemption, and both happened in public. It wasn't just that people would whisper, "You might be passed over," for business, denied marriage, excluded from festivals, or left off inheritance lists. Another, beware of Fabius the debtor. It was maintained by housewives with sharp tongues, shopkeepers with long memories, and magistrates who handed out shame like salt. Not because Rome was gentle, it certainly wasn't, but because violence was expensive, disruptive, and often less effective than shame. Or sat in silence at the edge of a fountain, listening to remind, to preserve the delicate balance of trust in a crowded world. No court case, long after the courts of Rome faded. The words remain quiet verdicts, scratched by everyday people in everyday outrage. And in many ways, these casual carvings outlasted formal law. Even religion played its role in minor punishments. Roman temples were more than places of worship. They were centers of civic record-keeping. Oaths were sworn at altars. Contracts were sealed before gods. These tablets were written in tiny script, sometimes rolled up and pierced with nails, and then buried in temple floors or tossed into sacred springs. A defixio might read, "Accurus Publius, who broke our pact, may his tongue rot, may his wine spoil, may his neighbors know his shame." No magistrate involved, just divine justice, personal, poetic, and often petty. These curses weren't punishments in the legal sense, but they were emotional retribution, part of Rome's rich web of informal consequences. And yet, for all this communal vigilance, Rome still made room for forgiveness. Not formal amnesty, though. That existed, but social repair. Just as a man could be shamed publicly, so too could he be restored. One common practice was the gift of apology. Neighbors might call for a song, a recitation, or a small act of labor as recompense, not to repay money, but to restore standing. Some communities even held ritual cleansings, where a person marked by scandal might be symbolically washed, dressed in white, and welcomed back with a shared meal. In Rome, punishment was real. Perhaps the most striking thing about Roman petty punishments is how little they relied on violence. In a world where honor meant everything, to lose face was to lose everything. Roman justice knew this, and so it weaponized the social fabric itself. A city doesn't need gallows on every street corner when the neighbors are already watching, judging, remembering. So what does this all mean? It means Rome wasn't only built by emperors and soldiers. It means the law didn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wore an apron or carried a broom. And it means that punishment wasn't always meant to destroy. Sometimes it was meant to correct. But this, too, leads us to wonder if dignity can be restored so easily. Was it ever truly lost? And if law lives in rumor, gossip, and grain markets, where does justice end and pettiness begin? In the end, Rome teaches us something quietly profound. That order does not come only from force. Sometimes it comes from the whisper, the laugh, the sideways glance, the broken pot at your feet. And in a city of a million voices, sometimes the smallest punishments are the ones that echo, traveler of shadows and sandaled roads. Tonight, our quiet path takes a darker turn, not into the terror of gladiator games or the frenzy of imperial murders, but into something strangely mundane. The image is infamous, but what you may not know is that in the Roman world, crucifixion wasn't extraordinary. It was, in fact, shockingly, routine, a bureaucratic function, filed like paperwork, scheduled like a delivery, and executed like a formality. You already know crucifixion as one of the most brutal methods of execution in the ancient world. Tonight, we explore the strange ordinariness of the cross, how Rome used it not as a spectacle alone, but as a tool of civic administration, and how thousands met their death not on grand hills before crowds, but at dusty crossroads, nameless and unmarked, because Rome believed the execution itself was less important than where it was placed. Let's begin with the setting. Imagine a Roman provincial town, not the glistening capital, but a modest outpost, perhaps in North Africa, or Judea, or Gaul. The roads here are wide, lined with rough paving stones. At key intersections, where merchants pass, travelers pause, and markets gather stand tall, weather-worn wooden posts. But Rome perfected it, not in creativity, but in efficiency, and nothing reminded the public of state power more than a man dying in silence, nailed in place, as life moved past him. Not monuments, not altars, execution stakes. These crossroads were not sacred, they were administrative. Places where punishment was most visible and, therefore, most effective. It was a public announcement of failure, not just of the criminal, but of the entire social order they represented. Rome believed the key to justice was a reminder. The crime would be read aloud. The condemned, usually already a prisoner, would be beaten or scourged, not to kill, but to weaken. Crucifixion was not a Roman invention. The practice existed earlier in Persia, Carthage, and among some Hellenistic states. He was led through town, sometimes naked, sometimes in a tunic, sometimes with a sign declaring his crime. By the late Republic, crucifixion had become a standardized punishment for specific crimes. If nailed, the wrists or forearms were pierced first, then the feet. If tied, rough cords would bind limbs in painful suspension to the sun, to birds, to insects, and to the gaze of every traveler who passed. Sometimes a small wooden seat was added not out of mercy, but to prolong the agony. Slaves who killed their masters, highway robbers, bandits, deserters, in military logs and civic registers, crucifixions appear as notations. Rebels and anyone without Roman citizenship who dared challenge authority. But it wasn't just about death. If Rome wanted someone dead, there were faster methods: beheading, strangulation, even poison. They were places of intersection, where different classes, tribes, and travelers passed. Placing a crucified body there ensured maximum exposure. No, crucifixion was used when the goal was deterrence. The process, for the most part, followed a chilling routine. It was a tool as ordinary as a tax form or a census count. It wasn't emotional. It was administrative. First came the sentence, often delivered by a magistrate or military officer. Then came the march. Even the height of the cross was sometimes dictated low enough to be seen, but high enough to prevent premature rescue. A necessary process, a reminder that order had a price and it would be paid in public, especially during mass executions, as after the Spartacus rebellion, when over 6,000 rebels were crucified along the Appian Way. The victim carried the horizontal beam of the cross, not the full cross, as is often imagined. This wasn't for drama. It was logistical. It let onlookers know what kind of behavior was being punished and by what authority, each a few dozen feet apart, lining the road for over 100 miles. Finally, the man would be nailed or tied to the cross at the chosen citofan, a main road or city gate, and then he would be left. No funeral, no burial, just exposure. Even then, many were granted the option of suicide or be. What's especially jarring is how casually crucifixion was handled in records. Crucified. 3 highwaymen. Via Latina. Crucifixion ordered. 2 deserters. North Gate. Executed. Slay. Cross maintained by garrison. Some wept. It's a story about how cruelty becomes normalized. A few threw stones. Slowly. Quietly. Bureaucratically. No names. No poetry. Just operations. Children passed by without staring. Vendors hawked goods nearby. Travelers waited in the shade of a crucifixion post. To the Roman bureaucracy, the cross was not a symbol, and that's the haunting part. To us, crucifixion carries moral weight, tragedy, injustice, even redemption. But to most Romans, it was background noise. This explains why crossroads were favored. Crossroads weren't just convenient, they were symbolic. It turned the condemned into a billboard of consequence. There's a chilling phrase in Roman law: service in a slave to the cross. It required no explanation, no trial. A master could say it aloud, and the slave could be executed. And yet, Rome wasn't lawless. Even crucifixion had its regulations. In some provinces, local governors had to approve crucifixions. In others, only military tribunals could order it. In some rare cases, the wood was reused. Thousands of men, nailed in sequence. That's not a punishment. That's a message in wood and blood. Still, not everyone could be crucified. Roman citizens were generally exempt, unless convicted of high treason. This made the cross a punishment for the stateless, the outsider, the conquered, the enslaved. It was a way of saying, you are not Rome. And now, everyone will see what happens to those who forget that. So what did the public think? Surprisingly, many ignored it. In large cities, crucified bodies became part of the urban landscape, like carts, dogs, or beggars. But others watched. They gawked, they spat, and they laughed. And occasionally, though rarely, someone tried to help. A bribe might remove the body early. A secret burial might be arranged at night. But usually, the cross did its work alone. So let us pause here, because this isn't just a story about cruelty. When a punishment loses its shock, when the extraordinary becomes ordinary, when a man nailed to wood becomes just another thing at the crossroads. But how long can a society use terror as a tool before the people stop seeing it at all? And when death becomes a formality, what does that do to the living? Let's continue quietly. Now, as we stand at the dusty edge of a Roman crossroad, we've watched how crucifixion, once a rare punishment, became a routine line item in imperial administration. How local authorities deployed it with mathematical precision. How even the wood, the rope, the timing, everything was calibrated not for justice, but for order maintenance. But the deeper we go, the more unsettling the truth becomes. Rome didn't just use the cross to punish. It used it to govern. In this section, we explore how crucifixion evolved from a tool of terror to a system of message management. His preserved field diary, though fragmentary, offers rare insight into crucifixion as a logistical task. It wasn't about death, it was about visibility. Second, postponed the festival of Mars. Risk of unrest. Reschedule after the feast. Across the empire, governors and military commanders received directives from Rome on how and when to use crucifixion, not just as punishment, but as policy implementation. Let's begin with an officer named Lucius Junius, stationed in a dusty outpost near the Syrian border. In one entry, he writes, executions were timed, placed, and even delayed based on civic mood. To Nabatean thieves caught, one was executed by cross at midday, placed near the olive grove by the Traders' Road, ordered slow bleed. Note the tone. Not cruel, but clinical. Not an act of passion, but a calendar note. This wasn't unique to Junius. One of the most chilling aspects of this system was how detached it became from moral weight. Not because someone was outraged, but because Rome had quarters to meet in cities like Carthage, Philippi, and Lugdunum. Crucifixion was used to enforce economic discipline, the kind of thing that needed immediate attention by force or fear. Smugglers, tax evaders, and coin forgers were nailed to roadside crosses not because Rome hated them personally, but because their behavior interrupted the flow of wealth. Think of that. Dying slowly, anonymously. But records suggest otherwise. You forge a coin to feed your family, and days later, you're hanging by your wrists at the city gate. There was also a clear formula behind the sentence. Who cursed the empire? Who prayed? Who hallucinated? Who sang? Take, for example, the rule of three, referenced in several Roman penal fragments. One man executed alone equals isolated behavior. Still another, a former soldier, gave orders to invisible troops. 3 men crucified together equals coordinated crime. They watched. It wasn't just a punishment. It was a memory anchor, or didn't. Some ignored the cries. Some listened too closely. People grew numb. Some rebels embraced the cross, using their public deaths as acts of defiance. They shouted slogans. They looked passersby in the eye. They died loudly. A few, like Seneca himself, remembered more than 5 equals public threat, rebellion, or unrest. Each number conveyed meaning. A single cross might signal misfortune. A row of crosses, disruption. Because crucifixion were tore, at least it seemed to. Others were set up at borders to send a warning to travelers. It sent a message. It cleared the streets of It reminded the conquered who was in charge. And sometimes the condemned were crucified in their own neighborhoods, especially if their crime involved betrayal of trust. A spear to the side, a twist to the neck, quiet mercy offered when the magistrate wasn't watching. And what of the victims? We often imagine them as silent. I could take no more. Even within the machine of punishment, there were cracks of humanity. I spoke to Flaccus. He nodded. I did it quickly. May the gods forgive us. The Roman philosopher Seneca, who had personally witnessed crucifixion, wrote that some victims lingered for days, their voices hoarse, their minds fading, but still alive. He described men who begged for death. One condemned man, according to Seneca, recited lines from a tragedy as if another barked like a dog to mock the guards. These weren't characters, they were humans, slowly crumbling beneath the weight of Rome's message. And the public, but not everyone was unmoved. There are scattered accounts rare, a poignant of sympathetic guards ending a crucifixion early. In one preserved letter from Egypt, a soldier writes to his brother, "The Judeans screamed for 3 days. This wasn't standard, but it happened." Rome also took careful note of location. Some crosses were placed outside city walls. Imagine that returning home, to see a neighbor nailed before the bakery, a sign above him reading "Thief of Bread." You wouldn't forget that image. Rome made sure of it. And yet, despite its brutality, crucifixion could also fail. If used too often, it lost its shock. In response, Roman officials sometimes ordered silencing measures, gags, broken jaws, and even blinding, because a crucified man who screamed was dangerous. But a man who spoke clearly, calmly, defiantly, that was worse. Still, Rome persisted. It cost little, and above all, it fit neatly into the system, with requisitioned by local carpenters. Rope cut from naval supplies, crosses stored outside town for reuse, execution sites rotated to avoid sanitation complaints, names logged. If remembered at all, crucifixion wasn't madness, it was management. So let us pause again, as dust gathers around the base of a Roman cross, because we must ask, when death becomes paperwork, when horror becomes habit, when pain becomes process, what happens to the soul of a society? And when people stop looking, is that the end of justice or the beginning of something worse? Let's conclude now, gently, with the final arc of this grim but strangely quiet tale. You've stood beside the roadside crosses, you've read the magistrates' ledgers, heard the fading voices of the condemned, and witnessed how the Roman state turned execution into an administrative detail. In this last part, we'll follow the legacy of crucifixion, how it persisted, how it shifted, and perhaps most revealing of all, how it was eventually forgotten. Not because it was too cruel. Civil wars, economic collapse, inflation, and invasions shook its foundations. Provinces, once neatly governed, now simmered with rebellion, famine, and disorder. But because it no longer worked, by the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire was stretched thin, and yet the crucifixions continued. Records from the reign of Emperor Decius show orders sent to regional governors, instructing them to maintain cross justice in areas with rising theft, desertion, or spirit of sedition. But something had changed. The cross was no longer feared the way it once was. In fact, in some parts of the empire, it had become expected, even routine. And in that predictability, it lost its power. A thief might joke, "I'll be decorating the crossroads by month's end." A runaway slave might say, "Better a cross than another year in the mines." The punishment, once symbolic, had become predictable. At the same time, Christianity was spreading. especially among slaves, soldiers, and lower classes, many of the same people most likely to suffer crucifixion. Their deaths were not erased, they were recorded and revered. Some governors switched to beheadings or fire. Others resorted to quiet disappearances rather than public death. And with it came a profound transformation of the cross's meaning. No longer just a tool of Rome, the cross became a symbol of martyrdom, no longer a symbol of state power. It had become the emblem of resistance, of salvation, of another kingdom. Christians who were crucified men, like Peter, Andrew, and unnamed converts in Syria and North Africa. It was a gateway, a test, a path to sainthood. A few Byzantine emperors even revived the slow cross as a political message, but these were rare and often condemned by religious authorities. Suddenly, the cross was no longer a threat. The practice appeared in certain interpretations of Sharia law, though not with Roman methods. Rome had lost control of its own instrument. The Roman state began to notice. The state could no longer use it without invoking God. But the historical reality, the bureaucracy, the paperwork, the crossroads was forgotten as Christian communities turned crucified bodies into holy relics and execution sites into places of prayer. Roman authorities grew uneasy. By the time of Constantine the Great, crucifixion had all but vanished from Roman law. And in 337 CE, Constantine, now a Christian emperor, banned crucifixion altogether. The nails, the silence, the tragedy, not out of mercy necessarily, but because the cross had been Rome's most feared punishment had become a monument to its failure to suppress belief. But Rome was not the only place where crucifixion lingered. In parts of the Byzantine East, the practice occasionally returned, usually for treason or war crimes. The Postlenes, the road is dusty, forgotten. In the Islamic Caliphate's crucifixion was sometimes used symbolically, usually, and in medieval Europe, the cross endured as a symbol, but not as punishment. The process had become too closely linked to the sacred, too soaked in meaning. And yet, something curious happened. As crucifixion faded from practice, it rose in myth. Plays, paintings, sermons, relics, and processions kept the image of the cross in front of the public. Instead, we remembered the hill. We remembered the few, not the thousands. We remembered the rare, not the routine. So what does all this tell us? It tells us that even the most brutal institutions can become invisible, ordinary, fallible. That Rome, in all its might, could hang a man at a crossroad and treat it like a weather report. That horror, when repeated enough times, begins to lose its edges and becomes just another part of the landscape. But it also tells us this: symbols are not owned forever. A punishment meant to humiliate can be turned into a badge of courage. A tool of suppression can become a monument of belief. Even the empire of iron and law could not control the meaning of its own instruments. So as we leave this story, let us return one last time to that unmarked Roman crossroad. The body has rotted, but the memory, the message, the long, quiet legacy of death as administration, that lingers. And perhaps the scariest part of all, it is not the punishment itself, but how boring it became. As the night deepens and the city of Rome fades into candlelight and silence, we settle into one of the oldest corners of its legal history, a time before emperors and senates held dominion over the law, before the great marble codices and imperial Tonight, we open the first book in Rome's dusty archive, the 12 Tables, often remembered as the bedrock of Roman law. The 12 Tables are rarely spoken of beyond a school child's chant, but hidden within them were laws so specific, so strangely detailed. But they reveal a Roman world where cutting someone, esnos off wasn't tea, just a violent act, it was a legal matter of high concern. Tonight's story is one of early rules, rural revenge, and the surprisingly literal world of ancient Roman justice. This is the story of the nosecutters and why Rome had to write them into law. Let us begin in 451 BCE. Over 2,400 years ago, the aristocratic patricians and the common plebeians were locked in constant tension. They inscribed 12 bronze tablets, displayed in the forum, meant to be clear, concise, and applicable to all. The plebeians demanded legal transparency laws written down so the elites couldn't manipulate them. The Roman Republic was still young, barely finding its footing. In response, the state appointed a board of 10 Mendae Decemvii Legibus Scribendus to draft a fixed public legal code. This was not a philosophical law code, like later Roman jurists would dream of. It was practical, literal, based on real complaints and recurring offenses. And one of those offenses, a missy nose, wasn't just an injury. It was a permanent advertisement of insult. Facial mutilation. It was what you showed in the forum, at the market, before the gods. Specifically, the cutting off of the nose. Why? The nose. An eye for an eye. A nose for a nose. In early Roman society, the face was identity, without mirrors, without portraits. Your face was your introduction. To disfigure a man's face was to mark him forever a walking testament of shame or conflict. A heated exchange turns into a scuffle. One pulls a knife for, perhaps a farm bladen slices the other's nose off in the dirt. And so, tucked among property laws and marriage clauses, the 12 tables addressed this crime. The phrasing, reconstructed from citations by later jurists, went something like, not money, not exile, but cutting off the attacker's nose in return. Si membrum rupit, nicum eo passit, talio esto. They were focused on order keeping the peace by offering clear, enforceable options. And in a time when the state had no police force, no regular courts, and little capacity to enforce penalties, retaliation had to be codified to prevent escalation. If he breaks another's limb, and they do not come to an agreement, let there be retaliation in kind. Talio esto, the law of retaliation, more famously known by its later Latin phrasing, lex te. Now imagine this in action. Two farmers argue over irrigation rights. One claims the other diverted a stream unfairly. What if the victim is older, sicker, or simply wants money instead? What if the attacker regrets it and offers something better than revenge, and people remembered it? What happens next? A nose for a nose remained a form of folk justice, especially when magistrates were far away and tempers ran high. If the victim and attacker can agree on compensation, say, a mule or a plot of barley, then the law considers the matter resolved. Instead of slicing a nose, you might pay 300 assiza, considerable sum, but less than losing a nose. You wouldn't stab his brother. But if they do not, then the victim may demand exact retribution, and the state will allow it. It had its own rule, and specific problem enough that the state wrote a law for it. Either agreed compensation or the exact same punishment to us. This sounds like barbarism, but to early Romans, it was balanced justice. It wasn't emotional revenge. It was symmetry. Rebels, traitors, and deposed rivals were often disfigured, not just to mark them, but to disqualify them from power. The 12 tables weren't focused on reform or forgiveness. If someone took your nose in, you knew the law would allow you to take his then. Perhaps you wouldn't take it further. You wouldn't burn his house. By the imperial period, facial mutilation had moved from being a citizen's retaliation to a state-imposed punishment. Jurists cited them with reverence, and the idea of measured retaliation, of punishment that mirrored the crime, survived in Roman legal thinking for centuries. You'd stop, because the balance had been restored. But as Rome grew more urbanized, this literal justice became more complicated. Soon, debates arose. What if the retaliation causes more damage than the original wound? Roman jurists began interpreting the 12 tables not as strict orders, but as frameworks. In time, monetary compensation became the norm. Still, the idea of talio esto remained on the books. In rural provinces, where central authority was weaker, the nose-cutting law lived on longer. Villagers cited it, families invoked it, and not all injuries were treated equally. The 12 tables listed several types of physical harm with custom fines. A broken bone, 300 asses if, to a free man, 150, If to a slave, a punch resulted in swelling, 25 asses damage to clothing, recompense in double value, and yes, for cutting a man's nose. This tells us something fascinating. The nose was legally unique. It wasn't grouped with other limbs. Why? Perhaps because of symbolism, or frequency, or maybe simply because, in those early days, nose cutting had become a common. As Rome matured, the practice of actual taglio declined. Emperors, especially in the Eastern Roman world, used nose cutting as a political sentence. A man with a mutilated face could not serve as consul, general, or priest. Thus, the nose, once a common sight of vengeance, became a symbol of disgrace. Its absence was like a signature of failure. But the 12 tables endured, long after the words were lost. Roman schoolboys still memorized fragments. Even today, the concept of lex talionis echoes in debates about fairness, justice, and the proper scale of consequence. It began with a nose, a simple act, a knife in the dust, and the question, how should Rome respond? But still, we must wonder, was balance truly restored by matching injury with injury, or did such justice merely spread the wound further? When is retaliation for end? When is it just another cut? Let us continue, slowly and steadily now, down the stone corridors of ancient jurisprudence. The 12 tables, cold and unyielding in their bronze permanence, offered early Romans something they had never truly possessed before: clarity. But clarity, as it turns out, didn't always bring peace. In this section, we look beyond the act itself, beyond the slicing of a nose end, into how the rule was applied, how it evolved, and the ways in which Romans wrestled with the unintended consequences of codified retaliation. Posted in a forum, etched in bronze, the laws were publicly accessible. Anyone who could read could recite the exact words of taglio West. The injured man refused any offers of compensation and insisted upon taglio. He demanded the exact same wound, inflicted publicly and with witnesses, because when the law permits you to injure someone back, the question becomes, should you? And more troubling still, what if the punishment goes too far? After the 12 tables were introduced in the 5th century BCE, Roman citizens finally had something they could point to literally, and this created an interesting side effect. People started using the law to justify revenge. Not just a tip, but half the nose was cut. The attacker sued for over-retaliation. There's a recorded dispute preserved only in summary by a later jurist between two craftsmen, one of whom had struck the other with a tool during an argument, severing the tip of his nose. The magistrate allowed it, and degradation could follow a man everywhere. To the market, the bathhouse, the forum. But here's the twist. The retaliatory blow caused more damage than the original. What followed was a rare but fascinating case. Taglio upon top, a third injury, now inflicted on the first man. This time overseen by a physician to ensure equal damage. This absurd escalation led to public outcry and, eventually, to legal reforms allowing for monetary compensation as default, unless both parties agreed to physical punishment. It was the beginning of Rome softening the edge of its own sword. Still, in rural areas, literal retaliation continued. It was a matter of pride, especially among landowners and military men, who believed that injury without answer meant weakness. A farmer might accept a donkey in exchange for a broken fence butt, not for a broken nose. A missing nose on a slave might be worth 50 din, while a prominent citizen's disfigurement could result in compensation exceeding 400. Facial disfigurement in early Roman culture was seen not only as a personal insult, but also as public degradation. In some regions, a cut nose meant disqualification from priesthood or exclusion from certain civic roles. I'll chip your tooth in court, or I'll pluck your ear by order of the magistrate. Some demanded taglio anyway, especially when they believed money couldn't match the insult. So a man who lost his nose might lose more than his face. He might lose status, marriage prospects, an inheritance. It's no wonder that so many men, when offered goats or gold, still chose steel in cases of facial disfigurement, especially those affecting marriageability. The damage could be severe, not only physically, but also socially. And so, Fathers often pursued Talio on their daughter's behalf, treating her injury as a family disgrace. Meanwhile, the state slowly tried to intervene. Under the reforms of Gaius, a prominent 2nd century CE, a set of new legal guidelines called for a quantified compensation for injuries. Noses, it seems, had a price. What if their wound healed worse than expected? What if retaliation caused unforeseen complications, infection, blood loss, or death? The values varied based on class, age, and social standing. The act had been legally sanctioned, but now the retaliator was charged with manslaughter. Gaius even wrote, somewhat dryly, though flesh may not be regrown, the damage may yet be measured. But despite the changes in law, many Romans remembered the old rites. The idea of bodily retaliation bled into Roman literature. In Plautus's plays, we find characters threatening to invoke Talio for comic effect, shouting lines like "You bloodied my lip." Rome had long since transitioned to more complex law codes, Edict of the Codex Theodosianus, and later the Corpus Juris Civilis under These lines made audiences laugh, but they also revealed how deeply embedded the logic of matching harm had become in Roman thought. Even children used the concept in playground threats. What you did, I'll do back, became not just instinct but law. And what about women? Roman law allowed women to bring injury claims, though with restrictions. A young woman with a cut lip, scarred cheek, or missy nose might be considered unfit for a good marriage. In some cases, the attacker was forced not only to suffer the same wound, but also to pay an added bride compensation to reflect the lost dowry or canceled engagement. Again, the nose was more than fleshed, was social currency. But as time went on, the Talio system ran into deeper trouble. What if someone had a medical condition? One particularly gruesome case, preserved in the Digest of Justinian, involved a retaliatory punishment that resulted in the accidental death of the defendant. The law had come full circle. The punishment of a punishment became a new crime. From this point forward, Roman courts began to discourage physical retaliation, altogether offering scaled damages, payment in silver, or symbolic gestures like public apology or branding. Talio, while still referenced, was functionally obsolete, but it was never removed from memory. By the 4th century CE, the 12 tables had faded into scholarly citations, but even then, the echoes remained. You still find jurists debating questions like, should a man who lost a nose in sport have the same rights as one wounded in anger? Can a slave retaliate in Talio for harm by another slave? Does intention matter in the loss of a nose? Each time, the lawyers turned back, not to philosophy, but to the ancient logic of balance. The wound must match. The wound must match the wound, unless it doesn't. So what began as a simple law, scratched into bronzif, he cuts. He may be cut in turn became a centuries-long meditation on the nature of justice itself. And the nose, it became the most famous part of the Roman face, not for beauty, but for its role as a legal turning point. But here we pause. If fairness is giving back what was taken, what happens when the taking takes something more? If a face is altered forever, can a blade or even a bag of silver ever truly restore it? And when law tries to mirror harm, does it bring peace or just a reflection of pain? Let us conclude this quiet and peculiar tale with one last look at the cut that defined an Arenata sword in battle. Not the lash of tyranny, but a simple wound to the face, a nose removed, a face changed. A question was asked: what is justice when the harm can't be undone? In this final section, we followed the afterlife of the Talio rule, the ways it echoed through Roman law, reshaped social thinking, and eventually disappeared not from memory, but from practice. Because Rome's genius was not only in building roads or conquering lands, it was in understanding when a law had served its purpose, and when society had outgrown the need for symmetry and blood. By the later emperors, especially in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the principle of talio esto had become mostly symbolic. Legal scholars no longer treated it as actionable law. Instead, they cited it as a kind of ethical origin story. A moment from the past that explained why Rome had transitioned toward monetary justice, formal trials, and regulated punishment. And in these areas, if a man lost a nose, he might still demand flesh for flesh, or at least threaten it to negotiate a better settlement. But in rural provinces, especially in frontier regions, where Roman law was thinly enforced, Tallio retained a ghostly presence. Local judges called iudices pedinaia, or foot judges, often ruled based on custom, not codex. In this sense, Tallio became leverage, a reminder that once the law allowed a man to do back what was done to him. The nose was engraved with the words pro hoc quod abstuli, or what I took. You could say, "You're lucky, I want to go." Their contents lived on in citations by later authors, Cicero, Gaius, Oppian. Each quoted fragment, often paraphrased, is colored by interpretation. Still studied, still admired, but no longer enforced. Cutting a nose wasn't just about the face, was about damages, injury value, and legal procedure. I could take your nose. Yet even as Rome evolved, the idea of symbolic restoration stayed strong. Instead of literal retaliation, courts increasingly encouraged public gestures of contrition, formal apologies, public kneeling, donations to the temple, or being paraded around with markings of guilt. Not because they copied Roman law, but because the impulse to match harm with harm is older than any empire. In some Germanic codes, specific body parts had assigned values on nose, an eye, a thumb. In one instance, a man who had struck another in the face was ordered to carry a small bronze nose on a cord around his neck for a week. He wasn't cut, but everyone knew what he had done. This shift from violence to symbolism reveals something deeply Roman. A belief that honor could be damaged, but also mended not with blood, but with ritual. Meanwhile, the 12 tables themselves were fading from view, but it had named them Tallio Vesto, Endure, a tool for managing community injury when the state was too weak to do so. They had never been preserved in foam, not in bronze, not on parchment. The nose loda. Tallio became part of this fading tapestry. The victim bleeds, but he knows the law is on his side. Not vengeance, not chaos. Law. By the time of the Corpus Juris Civilis, under Justinian in the 6th century CE, Tallio Vesto had been reduced to an academic reference. Roman law had matured beyond simple retaliation. It now concerned itself with intent, proportionality, contracts, and property rights. And yet, the principle never fully died. In medieval Europe, long after Rome's fall, many legal systems resurrected the idea of equal punishment. In Anglo-Saxon law, bought-and word payments were used to compensate for physical injury. In early Islamic jurisprudence, the concept of kisses retaliation in kind mirrored the Roman time, though with stricter controls and pathways for forgiveness and compensation. Even in the early modern period, echoes of an eye for an eye appeared in debates about capital punishment, retribution, and fairness. Rome had not invented these ideas. But what does this mean? Really? It means the Romans wrestled with the same dilemma we do today. What does fairness look like when someone is harmed? Can compensation restore what was lost? Is retribution just another harm wearing the mask of justice? Or is it necessary to prevent deeper chaos? The nose-cutting law seems primitive to us now, but for early Romans, it was an attempt at balance, and in its own strange way, it helped build a culture of responsibility. So let's return to that dusty scene. Two men argue. A blade flashes, a nose is lost. That moment small, brutal, simplest, a building block of civilization. Because a society that can codify harm, that can agree on limits, remedies, and acceptable retaliation, is a society moving toward structure, toward peace, not perfect, not gentle, but regulated. But still, we must ask, was the world better when a man could take a nose for a nose? Or is justice more just? When does it ask us to break the cycle? When it tells us, you were hurt, but you may not hurt back in kind. You must find another way. In the end, Rome chose that second path and moved from revenge to restitution, from nose for nose to coin for cut, from bronze tablet to bound volumes of reasoned law, and that not because it allowed a man to slice back, but because, eventually, it told him not to. As the hush of night thickens around you, tonight we journey not to the bustling streets of Rome or the dusty crossroads of execution, but far out across the sea, where the empire sent those that wanted to forget. We're speaking now of exile, not dramatic escape or glamorous retreat, but the cold, bureaucratic sentence handed down to senators, poets, generals, and even But not all exile was equal. Some were sent to distant villas, others to hostile borders. But the most curious and quietly crueler form of exile was being sent to a volcano, a literal one. Islands forged by fire, quiet enough to be forgotten, dangerous enough to be avoided. Yes, Rome, with all its order and ritual, sometimes punished people by sending them to live atop unstable, smoldering rocks. And tonight, we'll explore one of these strange destinations, the Aeolian Islands, where lava, sulfur, and loneliness met the heavy silence of punishment. To begin, let's understand the context. In Roman law, exilor is not always a punishment of desperation. It was often a substitute for harsher sentences. If you were a Roman citizen condemned to death, you could voluntarily choose your citizenship and possessions in exchange for life in a remote corner of the empire. In some cases, the state would simply assign exile as a sentence itself. This was known as deportatio, forced removal, to a specific location, under guard and with restrictions. Now, the destinations for these exiles were rarely pleasant. Then, there were prisons without walls, surrounded by boiling water and smoke. But among the worst were the volcanic islands north of Sicily, especially Volcano, Lipari. Today, they are picturesque. The air stung the eyes, the soil burned the feet. Water was scarce. He sent political rivals, disgraced nobles, and even family members to such locations publicly, sparing their lives while quietly erasing their influence. Food had to be ferried in. Let's take Volcano, for example. The island was infamous for its sulfur stench, bubbling mud, and a summit crater that spat fire with disturbing regularity. The Romans believed it was the forge of the god Vulcan, where he beat weapons for Mars beneath the ground. Few dared to live there willingly, and yet, for some exiles, it became home. By order of Emperor Tiberius, he was sentenced not to execution, but to banishment on Lipari, one of the volcanic Aeolian Islands. Why? Because the state sent him there. Even a minor priest was accused of interpreting omens unfavorably during an eclipse. One of the earliest references comes from the reign of Augustus, who began using island exile as a softer alternative to execution for upper-class offenders. The idea was elegant in its cruelty. Far enough away to prevent escape or sedition breathing was a struggle. Eyes watered constantly. Food came in via monthly deliveries. Mostly lentils, barley, and no wine, no fresh vegetables. A small detachment of guards might enforce the order. If none were present, the isolation itself was considered sufficient security. If they tried to escape, fish, if you could catch it, wild goats, if you were lucky and strong. One man, a former magistrate named Publius, turned his Lipari exile into a small school of Stoic philosophy, writing treatises on endurance amid hardship, unpleasant enough to break the spirit but survivable barely so, that Rome could claim mercy. A letter from the 1st century CE, written by a Roman guard stationed on Volcaio, describes the place like this. Too many stories of strength or resilience in one place, and the volcano was no longer seen as punishment. It became romantic. Heat beneath, heat above, and no company but the goats and the condemned. We build no temples here. Even the gods avoid this place. Among the most famous of these exiles was a senator named Lucius Cassius, known for his biting speeches and repeated insults to imperial dignity. And you'll learn to hold your breath. There, he lived for the rest of his days, in a kind of sulphurous twilight. No forum, no letters, no return. Others soon followed. A disgraced general after a failed campaign in Dacia. A poet who wrote a seditious satire. Volcano Islands became Rome's filing cabinet for the inconvenient. But what was daily life like for these volcanic exiles? Accounts are rare, but suggest a life of boredom, bitterness, and slow physical decline. The volcano method was seen as too slow and too uncertain. It left room for myth, for survival, for memory. On Volcano, the smell of sulfur pervaded everything. There were no cities, no forums, only crude dwellings carved into rock or thatched huts clinging to slopes. Rainwater was collected in jars. Wind tore down walls. And always, in the background, the hiss of steam from the earth. It was not a death sentence, but it was not living either. And yet, even here, in this grim place, the rules of Rome still applied. Exiles were expected to behave. Some were given strict restrictions. No writing, no receiving guests, and no traveling beyond a certain radius. And if an exile broke the rules, then the mercy ended. Execution followed, or worse, transfer to a work camp where one might mine salt until the body broke. Still, the system wasn't perfect. There are stories of exiles thriving in their volcanic prisons, gathering followers, fishing communities, and even teaching rhetoric to local villagers. When a young student from Naples sailed across to study under him, the state took notice and promptly moved Norbanus to a more remote island. Even in isolation, ideas had power. Rome, ever aware of image, began rotating exile locations. So Volcano was abandoned in favor of smaller, harsher spots. Desolate islets near Sardinia, barren coasts in Dalmatia, or crumbling forts in the Syrian desert. But the volcano exile left its mark. It became a byword, a phrase, whispered by the condemned. You'll see the mountain breathe, they'd say. Later, emperors like Nero and Domitian preferred faster executions. But for a brief span, roughly 1 century, Rome used fire and stone, smoke and silence as a way to erase the living without spilling their blood. And that, perhaps, is what made it so effective. You didn't see the body, you didn't hear the final words. You just knew they were gone. Somewhere hot, somewhere cracked, somewhere forgotten. But still, what does it mean that Rome chose volcanoes as a place of punishment? Did they believe the earth's wrath would finish what they started? That lava and time would do what politics could not? That fear, made of smoke and silence, would prove stronger than steel. And perhaps more unsettling still, how many lives were buried not under stone, but in the memory of an island no one dared visit? Let us drift further now past the surf and sulphur into the second act of this quiet punishment. In the last chapter, we walked the ashen ridges of Volcano and Lipari, where Rome cast away its inconvenient men like broken tiles. But exile, as the Romans practiced it, was rarely a simple thing. In this section, we explore how politics, philosophy, and power shaped the lives of those banished to the lava islands. Because even in the most remote corners of the empire, ambition, memory, and reputation lingered on. Not all exiles accepted obscurity and silence. Some endured, some turned exile itself into a stage. To understand this better, we need to trace the line between deportatio and relegatio, to kinds of Roman exile that looked similar but carried vastly different weights. Relegation was softer. You lost your right to live in Rome, or perhaps Italy, but kept your property and citizenship. It could last for a set period, often 5 or 10 years. This sentence was typically for life. Deportation, by contrast, was severe. You lost your property and your status and were forcibly settled in a designated location, often an island, sometimes a volcanic one. The volcanic exiles. We've been following those sent to Volcano Lipari. Rome didn't just want them gone. It wanted them erased. But humans, being humans, don't always cooperate with eraser. She was exiled in Oda BCE, accused of adultery, scandalous behavior, and political close enough to Rome to be reachable, but psychologically distant. Rome, embarrassed by her conduct and potential influence, sent her to the island of Pandateria, a bleak, wind-lashed speck in the Tyrrhenian Sea. Guards watched her every move. She spent 16 years in isolation, despite being the daughter of the most powerful man on earth. Take the case of Julia, the elder, daughter of Augustus, to teach others who found their way to his makeshift camp. Though not volcanic itself, Pandateria sat within the same ring of fire exile zone used by the Empire. She was forbidden wine, male visitors, and correspondent. Volcano and Lipari received lesser-known exiles, but their punishments followed this same pattern. Banishment as burial, silence as sentence, environment as executioner. Still, not all who were sent remained quiet. In 52 CE, the philosopher Musonius Rufus, a Stoic admired for his teachings on virtue and endurance, was exiled to one of the Ionian Isles. He used the time to cultivate a garden, to meditate on hardship. When a Roman administrator visited the island years later and found Rufus still preaching under a crude stone awning, he wrote, "He speaks as if the island were the Senate, and men listen as if they were citizens." This was exile not as an end, but as proof that virtue could survive volcanoes. Others were less noble. Some plotted return. There are scattered references in Roman archives of exiles bribing sailors, faking deaths, or reappearing in border provinces under false names. One intriguing letter, preserved in the Vindolanta tablets near Hadrian's Wall, mentions a traitor claiming to have once been condemned by fire and sent to the Isle of Ash before fleeing west. Was he lying for drama, or was he one of the rare few who had escaped the volcanic exile? We'll never know, but Rome believed that distance and dread were enough to discourage most. They didn't build fences on volcano. They didn't need to. The mountain hissed for them. Meanwhile, the volcano itself, Mount Vulcanus, remained restless. There were eruptions in antiquity, though rarely catastrophic. More often, there were gas bursts, earth tremors, and sulfuric fogs that stung the skin and eyes. Exiles described burnt lips, peeling fingernails, constant coughing, and visions in the steam. It wasn't torture in the traditional sense, but it was slow, ambient, and wearing. Living on volcano meant aging prematurely, meant swallowing ash, meant bathing in salt and stench, meant watching the mainland shimmer in the distance, yet remain forever out of reach. In Rome, with bureaucratic precision, ensured your supplies arrived just enough to keep you alive. No less, no more. One report from the reign of Antoninus Pius mentions a shipment log. To Amperi of barley, 1 jar of salted fish, 12 flat loaves, 2 buckets of water, 1 robe, 1 set of writing tablets. The tablets weren't a kindness, they were a test. If the exile wrote treason, the courier was required to report it. Many never used them at all. Some burned them for warmth. Others buried them. A few carved poems. Fewer still wrote apologies. Despite the silence of the volcano, the system eventually eroded. As the empire expanded and crises multiplied, exile lost its neatness. Governors became inconsistent. Emperors grew impatient. Execution once again became preferred, faster, final, and less prone to the volcanic exile slowly faded, remembered only in fragments. A few tombstones on Lipari bear inscriptions from these years, simple markers. Here lies the forgotten, or exiled, but not broken. The lava cooled. The winds shifted. Rome turned elsewhere. And yet, the idea lingered. Writers of the late empire began to use the volcano as a metaphor for anger suppressed, power withheld, or memory buried beneath stone. In one obscure poem by Rutilius Nemesianus, the exiled soul is described as a fire not seen, but always felt, an island breathing vengeance through smoke. It was exile as slow justice, as punishment without blood. As the long fade into nothingness, so now, dear listener, As we look out across the dark waters and imagine that glowing peak in the distance, ask yourself, which is worse? To die quickly, remembered, or to live slowly, forgotten, to be broken by blade, or worn down by wind, steam, and time? Rome thought it merciful to spare your life, but it made sure that even if you lived, you would never again matter. Not in court, not in history, not even in rumor. Just a figure among rocks, on an island that smoked but rarely spoke. Let's now return one final time to the volcanic winds, the blackened rocks, and the quiet figures walking alone across steaming ground. We've seen how Rome used these islands, volcano, Lipari, Stromboli, not for justice, but for erasure, not to break the body with blades or chains, but to let time and silence grind the soul down into ash. And yet, in this last part of our story, we shift focus, because while Rome tried to forget its exiles, the exiles, some of them, at least refused to disappear. They left behind fragments, inscriptions, letters, carvings, and whispered myths. Some resisted, some adapted. A few even found meaning in their punishment. So let's walk alongside them now, for just a little while longer. Not to judge, just to understand. We begin with one of the last known volcanic exiles of the 2nd century CE. A woman named Calpurnius, daughter of a provincial governor in New. At night, its red mouth glowed against the stars, belching lava and gas in rhythmic bursts. Locals called it the lighthouse of the Mediterranean. Not an ode, but in warning. Her crime, political correspondence. She had written letters, though later intercepted questioning imperial appointments and praising an unpopular senator who had fallen from favor. The punishment was swift. Deportation to Stromboli, the most active and violent of the Aeolian Islands. Unlike Lipari or Volcano, Stromboli didn't simmer, it exploded. Sometimes every few hours. Calpurnia lived there for at least 7 years. In that time, she carved a record of her life into the island's rock, a series of short, chiseled reflections, still barely visible today. The gods did not strike me, men did. I speak now only to the sea. I am not silence, though Rome pretends I am. Fishermen, traders, religious hermits, and into their orbit, the exiles entered, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes gratefully. Olives and figs could grow. Rain was more frequent. The air is less toxic. The final mark reads simply, "Still here." I built one in thought, not for everyone, but among certain circles, especially among Stoics. Being exiled meant you had spoken truth too loudly. They burned my name. I carved a new one into salt. She died there, likely of illness. Her bones mixed with those of earlier exiles, buried without ceremony in black volcanic soil. But not every exile left in bitterness, or simply in the way. Some, especially those sent to Lipari, found ways to build lives. The soil there, though rocky, was more fertile. And most importantly, there were people. A small local population existed on Lip. A few taught Greek. Others healed with herbs. One exile, a disgraced architect named Marcus, reportedly helped build a water system still used centuries later. Another, Laelius of Ephesus, wrote poetry under the name The Ocean Pen, his most famous surviving line. Later, the misused island exile as a form of pre-execution staging. First, the volcano, then the sword. They took my city. Over time, exile itself became a kind of social mirror. To be exiled was not always a sign of guilt. It could mean you were dangerous to the wrong person, or too visible in the wrong moment. The philosopher Epictetus once said, "In Rome, exile is a kind of shadow. It follows those who shine too brightly." And so, paradoxically, exile gained a strange prestige. He lived in a cave, praying and writing sermons in charcoal on the rocks. For these thinkers, the volcano wasn't a tomb. It was a testing ground. Not with a law, but with a whimper. Even emperors felt its breath. Exile lost meaning in a world already fractured. with no ships to enforce it, no scribes to record it. Pilgrims visited the old paths, believing they walked in the steps of saints and rebels, and no state to feed the forgotten. The system simply stopped. Nero threatened senators with banishment to the Isle of the fire god Volcanoith. They refused to praise his poetry. By then, the symbolism was clear. Volcano equals warning. Leave equals die. Comply equals rot, slowly in sulfur. Resist and become a name whispered in history's margins. And yet, many chose the volcano over submission. As Christianity rose, exile remained, but its meaning changed. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, Christian bishops and theologians were increasingly exiled to islands, often for theological disagreements with Rome's new orthodoxy. One such figure, Bishop Paulinus, was sent to Volcano for refusing to denounce a fellow cleric. His followers gathered secretly on boats nearby, listening to his words carried by the wind. Years later, after his death, one young deacon wrote, "He spoke through smoke. We heard God in the steam." Even the volcano, once a symbol of imperial wrath, was being now a place of testimony. Eventually, the volcanic exiles ended as the Western Roman Empire collapsed. Its administrative precision faded. The volcanoes remained, but their condemnation did not. And yet, the idea lived on in whispers, in legends, in lonely stones. Island monasteries were built where prisons once stood, and the volcano still burns, still smokes, still watches. So now, we end this story the only way it could end, with a question. If you were condemned not to pain, not to death, but to be forgotten, would that be punishment enough? If the world closed its gates, turned its face, and left you with only rock and smoke, would you fade? Or would you carve your name into stone, even knowing the wind will one day wear it away? Rome believed exile by volcano was mercy, but mercy, in the end, is a judgment of perspective. And sometimes, the quietest punishments are the ones that echo longest. Tonight, we step into one of the coldest chambers of Roman law, not a courtroom or prison, but a household, a Roman domus, stately and orderly on the outside, filled with marble floors, garden courtyards, and shaded porticos. Within these walls, beneath the structure and civility, lived another world. The world of enslaved people, invisible to law, except when things went wrong. And when a Roman master died, violently by poison, blade, or strangulation, there was no forensics, no careful investigation, no patience. There was a procedure, and that procedure said this: if a Roman citizen was murdered in his home, and none could be proven innocent, then all the household slaves were guilty. Tonight, we explore this terrifying legal reflex to automatic, often brutal trials faced by slaves after their master's death. We follow the logic, the cruelty, the rare acts of resistance, and the haunting silence of those who had no voice under the law. This is not the story of an individual. It is the story of a rule, and the thousands who suffered under it. His motive was personal, but the law did not pause for motive. Let's begin in 61. A wealthy Roman named the city prefect under Emperor Nero was murdered in his sleep, stabbed by one of his own household slaves. There were over 400 slaves in his household at the time. The assassin was caught, a centuries-old legal precedent, dating back to the early Republic and reaffirmed under Augustus, stated clearly. But because they had not stopped the killing, if a master is murdered within his home, and the slaves neither prevent it nor raise alarm, they are accomplices. And so the Senate, despite public protest, ordered all 400 to be executed, men, women, and children. Not because they had killed. This wasn't mob violence, it was state policy. If a slave could kill that master without fear, the foundation of Roman order trembled. The reasoning was simple, terrifyingly so. Crowds gathered, demanding clemency. Senators debated, but tradition held. A Roman household was a miniature kingdom. The master's authority was absolute, so the law demanded not just punishment, but deterrence. It didn't matter if you were asleep in the kitchen, feeding a baby, or drawing water from the atrium. If your master died under your roof, and you failed to defend him, you were presumed guilty. But more than that, because they were considered internal threats living within the walls, holding knives, carrying wine, and overhearing secrets. This was not justice as we understand it. It was collective accountability, enforced by pain. Roman writers struggled with this policy. The historian Tacitus, writing about the Pedanius Secundus case, noted that public outcry followed the sentencing. The executions proceeded, and the law remained unchanged. Why did Rome do this? In part, because slaves were property, not persons, and so Rome developed preemptive laws to keep them in fear. A slave couldn't testify in court unless tortured. A slave couldn't accuse a master. A slave couldn't inherit, own, or refuse a command. But most of all, a slave could not fail to protect the master even from other slaves. If one killed, all were suspect, because in Rome's eyes, silence was conspiracy. His for household slaves, all teenagers, were executed within a day. No trial, no evidence, just procedure. So what happened after a suspicious death? A domestic inquest was launched, not a trial, but an inspection. The household was sealed, slaves were separated, interrogated, and tortured. Anyone who cracked under pressure, even falsely, could implicate others. If no single perpetrator was identified, the whole household could be condemned. A senatus consultum, Senate decree, might be issued to authorize mass execution. Sometimes these were public, performed in the amphitheater as a warning. Other times they were carried out quietly, one by one, behind the villa walls. Either we give him duty or we give him chains, but not both. Not all cases involved hundreds of slaves. Smaller households might have 5 or 10, and even then, if a master was found dead without clear cause, all could suffer. There is a case from the early 2nd century CE. A minor nobleman in Cumae died of suspected poisoning. It was known as iusta pona, the just punishment, even if it wasn't justice. And yet, some Romans resisted. Occasionally, owners freed their household slaves in their wills, hoping to protect them from collective punishment in the event of their death. Others kept very small households, relying more on freedmen and hired help. And a few rare but notable testified against the policy itself. One senator, Gaius Cassius Longinus, argued in the Senate, if a slave must be a bodyguard, then he must be armed. And if he is armed, we will fear him. It was a rare moment of clarity in a system built on contradiction. But nothing changed. The law wasn't about fairness. It was about order. And slaves, by their very existence, reminded Rome of the thin line between ruler and ruled. If they were allowed to live after a murder, what might they believe they were allowed to do next? So the state answered with certainty, not nuance. So let us pause here. In a house where one man dies and 10 others are executed, not for killing but for failing to stop it, what is law? Is it protection or is it fear? And what kind of justice is built on the assumption that the powerless must die so the powerful can sleep soundly? Let's quietly return now back inside the cool, tiled atrium of a Roman home. It's morning. A master lies dead, his eyes wide, mouth frozen. The room fills not with cries of mourning, but with footsteps, the heavy sandals of inspectors, the whispers of frightened freedmen, and the silence of slaves who already know what comes next. No one has confessed. No one saw anything, but all will suffer, because in the eyes of Roman law, the entire body of servants becomes suspect. If the master had high status, a prefect or urban praetor might be summoned. In this second section, we examine what happened after a suspicious death, how a Roman household's internal world collapsed under the weight of legal custom, and how the response to a single crime became a carefully orchestrated ritual of fear. In large villas, this meant dozens, even hundreds, of people were suddenly under suspicion. After a violent death, the first authority to arrive would often be the magistrate, sometimes accompanied by a team of lictors and the magistrate's job was to to solve the murder, but to document it and begin collective accountability. This wasn't an exception, it was standard procedure. The entire household, free and enslaved, was locked down. No one could leave. Doors were sealed. And so, even before blame was assigned, even before facts were known, screams filled the halls of the once quiet home. And while freedmen might be questioned, it was the slaves who bore the brunt. The process began with torture. Roman law allowed, indeed, required slaves to be tortured during interrogation. Slaves were not considered reliable witnesses unless they confessed under pain. The methods varied. It was compliance, a name. The master, in Roman eyes, was the center of the domasta household, not just as a building, but as a unit of law, power, and tradition. Anything to push the case forward. Flagrant beatings, USEA, a multi-thonged whip, crucifixion threats to induce panic, heat, thirst, or confine darkness, especially in basements and storage rooms. The goal wasn't truth. In a system where one name might spare many, the math became unbearable. If one could be blamed, perhaps the rest could live. And if no one confessed, the case defaulted to collective guilt. This process had legal teeth, and often, even after a supposed killer was identified, the state proceeded with mass execution. Any way claiming that silence itself was treason. The principle was known as pona savorum communista, shared punishment of slaves. It was both a punitive mechanism and a deterrent. In theory, slaves should have prevented the murder. His death was seen as an attack on Rome itself, so the law treated the household like a single organism. If one limb was diseased, the whole body had to be punished. It didn't matter if a slave had just arrived from the market, or was 10 years old, or blind, or innocent. It was a failure. The group bore the sentence. Some slaves, in desperation, began accusing each other. This wasn't always malicious. Others restricted slave access to weapons, keys, and rooms with valuables. But in practice, this only fed the wheel. Each accusation led to new rounds of questioning, new tortures, new fear. A household was expected to defend its master or die trying. Failure to prevent his death, even unknowingly, was seen as complicity. There are records of households where entire staffs were eliminated. New slaves were warned, if he dies, so do we. 15 cooks and stewards executed after a senator collapsed from poison at a banquet. A nursemaid was hanged alongside a gardener after their mistress was smothered in her sleep. 22 slaves were burned alive in the arena after failing to raise an alarm during a nobleman's strangling. In each case, it wasn't murder that was punished. But even in the heart of this machinery, small acts of resistance occur. Some household members, often freedmen or lower-ranking clients, intervened writing appeals, bribing minor officials, even forging wills that granted manumission to slaves posthumously. One famous case involved a physician slave named Mel, who successfully proved through anatomical diagrams that his master's death had been from stroke, not murder. It was a rare victory. Most weren't so lucky. Still, these events left their mark. The fear of collective punishment meant that many masters lived in paranoia. Some kept their bedrooms locked, even from their own staff. Some hired private guards not to protect against thieves, but to protect against their own slaves. And some kept body-doubles loyal freedmen who dressed like them, slept near them, and acted as decoys. When fear governs the house, everyone becomes suspect. What's striking is how normalized this became. Children were raised in households where executions had occurred, and masters, far from questioning the system, relied on it. It gave them power not just in life, but beyond death. Their deaths could still command executions, still shape fear, still affirm Rome's hierarchy. Even in the grave, they ruled. So where does this leave us? If a man could be killed by his own hand or die of illness, and yet his slaves still be punished, then what kind of logic held the empire together? What does it mean to be guilty by design? To be denied innocence, not for what you did, but for what you failed to do, even unknowingly, even silently? And how do you survive? when survival itself is treated as a sign of guilt. Let us finish this story in the quietest corner of the Roman world, not in the forum or amphitheater, but in the back room of a villa, where oil lamps flicker and footsteps approach. A slave stands beside a doorway, eyes low, breath held. His master is dead. The household is in chaos, and he already knows. It does not matter that he did nothing. His life will now be decided by a system built to see him not as human, but as evidence. This is the final arc in the story of how Rome's laws turned servants into suspects, and how silence, absence, or mere breath could be punished as severely as guilt. Because in the end, what Rome feared most was not the act of murder itself, but the idea that those below might stop fearing their place. In this last section, we explore the aftermath of these punishments, the long-term impact on Roman households, slave life, and the way memory itself was reshaped by a single death within the walls. We've seen how laws are used collectively, but what did that do to the culture of the home? The Roman domus was, on the surface, a place of order, columns, symmetry, hierarchy. Masters sat in the tablinum, overseeing affairs. Matrons managed household duties. Slaves operated behind curtains, running water, food, and fire. Rooms that went unused. Tools left untouched. But after a violent death and collective punishment, something deeper changed. There were gaps. They wanted to see me scream, so they knew I was not hiding anything. A whisper of treason. If they had been part of a punished household, their manumission could be questioned. Their loyalty is doubted. Empty spaces where slaves once lived and forcibly returned, only to find that everyone from his villa, save the dogs, had been executed. Some Roman writers noted the haunted feeling of villas after such events. One rhetorician wrote, "I entered the house of the dead senator, and though the marble remained, I heard no footsteps. The walls breathed silence. Some surviving slaves, if spared, were often branded, relocated, or never again allowed inside another Roman household. Their mere presence was seen as bad luck, and fewer still believed. Many were shipped to mines or farms out of sight, out of society. If they tried to speak of what had happened, few listened." One exiled steward, writing in a letter fragment from the 3rd century, said, "I was loyal. I was there. I saw the blade, and I ran to help. But that was not enough." Freedmen, too, walked a fine line. Though legally protected, many former slaves still bore deep scars, emotional, legal, and literal. Some changed their names, fled cities, or settled in ports where memory faded faster. One man, once a household secretary, lived under a false name in Gaul for a decade before being recognized. Rome remembered, even if it did not always forgive. Others justified it as necessary earthly discipline. And one of the broader consequences, the fear of mass punishment, caused many slave-owning families to adopt stricter surveillance. Freedmen replaced slaves in many positions. Trust slowly returned only because the system of mass terror became unprofitable. No unsupervised movements at night. Sleeping quarters are separated from family areas. Food tasters are assigned, even for children. Household shrines are rededicated with protective prayers. Masters, in their paranoia, created households that functioned like prisons not just for slaves, but for themselves. There are even records of senators keeping recording scribes to track household events by the hour, in case something ever went wrong. In this way, the fear that slaves might rebel or fail to protect their master didn't lead to trust, but to surveillance and suspicion. The legal legacy to endured. Do they not bleed? Though we own their blood. Though later emperors like Hadrian and Antoninus Pius attempted to soften the laws around slave punishment, the core idea of collective accountability remained embedded in Roman thinking. Even centuries later, when Christianity took deeper root, slave laws still retained echoes of this principle, requiring entire groups to be disciplined when one among them failed. Some bishops condemned it. The logic was durable. Control the many by holding them all accountable for one. But over time, cracks began to show. As the Roman economy strained and slave labor declined, the domus began to change. But the stories remained. Fear that those below might rise. Fear that one death could unravel control. Fear that silence might be louder than obedience. Every region had tales of the bloodhouse, the villa where an entire staff was executed, or the cook who screamed until he confessed to a crime he hadn't committed. These were not myths. They were memories, passed down from servant to servant, whispered through corridors, carried into every new household. In rare cases, Romans tried to reflect on the morality of it all. The philosopher Seneca, whose own household held many slaves, once wrote, "Are they not men, though we call them less?" He questioned the system, urged compassion, cautioned against cruelty. But even Seneca never challenged the collective punishment law directly. Even he, in the end, benefited from its silence. So let us end here, at the threshold of a house once filled with people cooks, porters, wet nurses, scribes, stable hands, now empty. One man died, and because of that, so did 30 others. Not by accident, but by custom. Rome, for all its roads, baths, and marble, built its legal system on a foundation of fear. And in that fear, it created punishments that outlived reason and, often, justice. So now, in the quiet that follows this story, a final question remains. If law can be followed perfectly and still lead to horror, what, then, is justice?